and they really go beyond hate speech. And again, like really seem to confirm that this community is targeted as a whole.
They say the Burkinabè army restrained innocent civilians in Solenzo and took their lives without mercy. They say Ibrahim Traoré is fueling ethnic tensions against the Fulani. They say the country is spiraling into unchecked chaos. But who exactly are they? And more importantly, when did they ever care? The Western media's sudden fixation on Burkina Faso isn't random. For years, the same outlets barely murmured about the devastation sweeping across the Sahel. Entire villages have been wiped off the map, thousands have lost their lives, and millions have been uprooted, yet barely a headline surfaced. But now, with one village, one clip, and one perfectly timed story, suddenly every human rights organization, every reporter, every foreign official is demanding answers. Why now? Why here? This isn't about victims, it's about strategy and timing. Just as Burkina Faso begins shaking off external control, politically, militarily, and economically, the full weight of the global narrative machine descends. One localized event suddenly becomes international evidence. A young leader is recast as a national threat. The state is placed under suspicion. And those who've spent years defending their land in silence are swiftly labeled aggressors, without a hearing. What if this isn't spontaneous outrage, but carefully constructed theater? What if the story that flooded global media left out its first half, the part where the so-called victims weren't just bystanders, but possibly linked to hostile actors? What if the cries of persecution are not meant to protect lives, but to crush opposition? Let's get started. Solenzo. A small town most of the world had never heard of, until a shaky video emerged, followed by a rush of headlines too synchronized to be a coincidence. Within hours, the narrative was global. The Burkinabè military and local volunteers had carried out a violent operation against Fulani civilians. There were claims of individuals being restrained, mistreated, and fatally harmed. Images showing casualties surfaced online. The phrasing in every report felt eerily uniform. Mass atrocity, targeted attack, ethnic persecution. There are no confirmed names, no verified timeline. But the media storm didn't pause delay kills momentum, because in this kind of momentum, this particular story had a deadline. It is often said that truth takes time, while propaganda moves at lightning speed. In the case of Solenzo, the timing wasn't just suspicious, it was strategic. The footage was released just days after Burkina Faso announced yet another bold economic move, cutting foreign aid dependency and expanding regional military cooperation. Coincidence? Maybe. But what followed didn't feel spontaneous. It felt scripted. First, an unverified clip. Then, a leak to one or two wire services. Next, a statement from a human rights group, typically one tied to Western funding. Finally, the amplification machine kicks in, with famous media houses commenting. Within 48 hours, the story had reached millions. And yet, for all its reach, it rests on unverified claims, anonymous sources, unnamed witnesses, quotes from organizations that couldn't confirm whether those affected were civilians or affiliated with armed groups. But the label had already been applied: Fulani civilians wrongfully targeted. The conclusion was delivered before anyone had the full picture. The language used is always the giveaway. In coverage of a U.S. bombing of a wedding convoy in Afghanistan, the phrase was tragic collateral damage. When French forces mistakenly struck a wedding gathering in Mali, causing civilian deaths, it was described as a miscalculated strike. But when African forces, responding to threats in areas long occupied by armed insurgents, conduct security operations, it becomes targeted ethnic violence. The shift in tone isn't accidental. It's part of a hierarchy of narrative. When Western powers cause harm, it's unfortunate. When African governments act, especially those not aligned with Western interests, it's labeled barbaric. And it's not just the words, it's the framing. The Solenzo footage, for example, shows bodies in the bush. No video of the lead-up, no footage showing combat, no interviews with the local defense groups, no statements from village elders, only aftermath. There are no location markers, no identified affiliations. The The viewer is given nothing to understand what led to this moment. But that's precisely the point. In the absence of context, emotion wins. And once emotion takes hold, judgment becomes automatic. From the first frame, the audience is directed to one assumption. Those affected were innocent, and those in uniform are responsible. Why does this pattern repeat so predictably? Because international journalism, especially in crisis reporting, often prioritizes saturation over substantiation. The aim isn't always to discover the truth, but to create a shared perception. Repeat a version of events enough times, and it solidifies as fact. That's what happened with Solenzo. By the time deeper investigation becomes possible, if it ever does, the moment has passed. Public perception has moved on, but the reputational damage remains. The name Traore becomes tainted. The image of Burkina Faso is distorted, and every future operation to secure its borders now unfolds under a cloud of suspicion. But let's look closer. Why is the story so clean? Why does it always follow the same structure? A powerful state preying on passive civilians. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Anyone who understands the reality of asymmetric warfare knows how murky the lines become. Insurgents operate in disguise. Militants seek refuge among villagers. Some are coerced into helping. Others cooperate willingly. But none of this subtlety ever enters the reports. The narrative remains black and white. Fulani civilians versus a violent state. There's no mention of territorial control. No context about previous attacks. No explanation for why the army was even in the area. Just an emotionally loaded moral conclusion. And then there's the question of sourcing. Western media is always eager to quote local voices, unless those voices support the government. Then they're dismissed as biased. But if a caller from abroad claims to have seen the entire event on a voice note, suddenly it becomes credible. If an unnamed NGO staffer says the individuals looked like civilians, it's headline-worthy. Meanwhile, if Burkina Faso's military provides an official briefing explaining the operation's objective, it's buried in the final paragraph, or excluded altogether. This isn't journalism. It's narrative management, a reverse courtroom where guilt is pre-assigned and defense isn't permitted. That's why the Solenzo narrative feels too perfect, because it is. The real conflict is confusing, contradictory, and chaotic. But this version, it's tightly packaged, visually shocking, ethically loaded, and delivered right on schedule to undermine a government the West no longer controls. This isn't the first time we've seen this tactic, and it won't be the last. But if we don't expose the method behind the messaging, we'll fall for it again, when the next Solenzo hits the headlines. Because this was never just about what happened in a small village. It's about what needs to be seen, in video, in headlines, and your perception. Once the narrative has been built, once the images from Solenzo have been plastered across the internet, and once the headlines have branded the Burkinabè state as the aggressor, the next piece of the puzzle falls quietly into place: identity politics. And in this case, it's centered around one word: Fulani. In the coverage of any conflict involving the Fulani, that single label is used like a sledgehammer. The Fulani were unlived. The Fulani were targeted. The Fulani are victims of state violence. It's a powerful label because it immediately evokes the sense of ethnic cleansing, of historical trauma, of a persecuted minority. But in the rush to amplify victimhood, no one stops to ask, which Fulani? Because the Fulani are not a monolith. And the deliberate erasure of that distinction is not just intellectually dishonest, it's dangerous. The Fulani, or Pul, are one of the largest and most widespread ethnic groups in West Africa, with communities across more than a dozen countries, from Senegal to Nigeria to Chad. Their traditions, languages, and livelihoods vary dramatically. Some are pastoralists, others traders, scholars, politicians, or religious leaders. In places like Guinea and Senegal, they dominate the business and education sectors. In others, such as Mali and Burkina Faso, they include nomadic herders living in remote areas often beyond the reach of the state. There is no single Fulani story, and certainly no single Fulani political agenda. And yet, when violence erupts in the Sahel, this complexity is tossed aside. Suddenly, Fulani identity becomes a shorthand for two conflicting narratives. Either they are helpless civilians being hunted for their ethnicity, or they are shadowy insurgents spreading across West Africa. Which version appears depends on the geopolitical script of the moment. What's rarely acknowledged is that for over a decade, violent groups in the region have increasingly recruited from Fulani communities, especially in border zones where state neglect, poverty, and interethnic clashes have created fertile ground for radicalization. In some areas, armed cells have openly flown insurgent flags and enforced Sharia, and yet, in most international coverage, this fact is treated like a footnote, if mentioned at all. The result is a toxic oversimplification. When Fulani civilians are harmed, the West cries genocide. But when Fulani insurgents massacre non-Fulani villagers, whether Christian or Muslim, the story is framed as communal violence, local conflict, or, at best, a tragedy of misunderstanding. The scale of violence, the decapitations, the ambushes, the torching of entire communities is systematically underreported. The victims vanish from the Western conscience. The killers, if named at all, are described as unidentified gunmen, even when the communities themselves know exactly who they are. This selective blindness has consequences. It not only emboldens militant groups who know their crimes will be whitewashed or ignored, but it also puts innocent Fulani civilians at risk by shielding violent actors behind an entire ethnicity. When the West refuses to distinguish between Fulani civilians and Fulani militants, it creates the very environment where broad suspicion and retaliation can occur. It is, ironically, the same dynamic the West accuses others of promoting. But the silence is not accidental. Acknowledging Fulani insurgency would mean acknowledging the ideological war being fought in the Sahel, a war not simply over ethnicity, but over the future of African sovereignty. Groups like Katiba Makina, led by Amadou Koufa, have fused Fulani identity with a radical Islamist mission. They don't just fight governments, they fight the very concept of secular African states. They preach allegiance to global insurgent networks, reject colonial borders, and offer an alternative vision of governance, rooted in hardline religious law. And in areas where the state is weak or absent, some communities, Fulani and non-Fulani alike, are forced to comply out of fear or desperation. Yet this ideology is rarely mentioned in reports about Fulani victims. Why? Because it complicates the narrative. It raises questions about who is armed, who is sheltering militants, and who may be participating in the insurgency. Questions that make it harder to cast Traore's forces as unprovoked butchers. So the complexity is erased, the nuance is buried, and the world is left with a fake binary. Fulani is equal to victims, and the state is equal to aggressors. Even worse, the weaponization of Fulani identity extends beyond the battlefield. In international diplomatic forums, mentioning Fulani grievances is now used as a pressure tool. Western governments and NGOs frequently cite ethnic tensions as a reason for sanctions, investigations, or calls for external monitoring in Burkina Faso. But again, the pattern is clear. No such interventions are ever proposed when Fulani-led violence spills into Nigeria or Mali. No one proposes sending UN troops to protect villages burned by Fulani insurgents. It only becomes a global issue when a government resisting Western influence is involved. This hypocrisy is glaring. It is not the Fulani who are being defended, it is the narrative. A narrative that casts the West as a moral guardian and Burkina Faso as a failed state in need of saving. And the more the West can frame Fulani identity as under attack, the more they can justify international intrusion. It becomes a humanitarian mission, a call to action, a tool for regime change with a moral halo. Meanwhile, ordinary Fulani people, many of whom want nothing to do with insurgency or war, continue to suffer, trapped between insurgent recruiters and military suspicion, abandoned by those who claim to defend them, used as symbols by people who will never step foot in the Sahel. And that's the tragedy no one wants to talk about. By now, it's clear that the outrage over Solenzo is a carefully constructed narrative. But to understand why it's happening, and why now, you have to understand the man they're trying to destroy. Because Ibrahim Traoré didn't suddenly become the center of global controversy by accident. He became a target the moment he decided to do something unforgivable in the eyes of Western power: take his country back. When Traoré rose to power in 2022, few in the West took him seriously. He was young, bold, and unfiltered, everything Western diplomats find uncomfortable in an African leader. At just 34, he represented something that couldn't be controlled, not by embassies, not by foreign advisors, and certainly not by NGOs. Unlike the usual technocratic puppets parachuted into African politics with World Bank briefcases and UN talking points, Traoré didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for applause. He acted. His first moves were not symbolic. They were strategic. French military bases, long considered untouchable relics of colonial muscle, were shut down. French troops were told to pack their bags. The status quo, where Paris could dictate military deployments and intelligence operations inside a supposedly sovereign state, was ended with a single order. This wasn't just a diplomatic slap, it was an act of rupture. It severed a decades-old arrangement that allowed France to maintain indirect control over Burkina Faso's security apparatus. But Traoré didn't stop at the military. He turned to economics. He started auditing mining contracts, particularly in the gold sector, where Western companies, often operating through opaque subsidiaries, had been extracting billions while leaving behind only environmental devastation and corruption. In a move that rattled boardrooms from Toronto to Paris, he announced plans to reclaim national resources, renegotiate contracts, and prioritize local value chains. In short, the era of looting was over. Then came the regional alliances. Traoré reached out to Mali and Niger, two countries also led by transitional military governments who had rejected French presence and neo-colonial pressure. Together, they formed the Alliance of Sahel States AES, not just a military pact, but a statement of political unity. The goal? Joint defense, economic cooperation, shared intelligence, but above all, independence. No more calling the Quai d'Orsay for permission to defend their borders. No more waiting for American-made drones to protect their people. No more IMF shackles disguised as assistance. For Western strategists, this was a nightmare scenario. Not only was Traoré standing up, he was inspiring others to do the same. The West's entire playbook relies on fragmentation. Keep African states divided, isolate their struggles, and use bilateral aid to control their behavior. But the AES was different. It was collaborative, sovereign, and grounded in a common experience of betrayal. Traoré wasn't just rejecting the West, he was building something to replace it. And then, he did the unthinkable. He began talking about alternative partnerships, engagements with Russia, talks with China, public praise for BRICS, invitations to Pan-African economists and thinkers. He wasn't hiding it. He was declaring, on international platforms, that the future of Africa would not be written in Paris, Brussels, or Washington. It would be written in Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, by Africans for Africans. That is the real threat. Not human rights abuses, not battlefield misconduct, but the political virus of sovereignty. Because once a country breaks free and survives, it proves that it can be done. And then the questions start. Why does Senegal still house French troops? Why does Ghana depend on the IMF? Why is South Africa still playing both sides in global politics? Traoré threatens not just Burkina Faso's colonial relationship, he threatens the illusion that those relationships are necessary. And so the demonization campaign begins. The West doesn't send tanks, it sends headlines. It doesn't need assassins, it needs images, clips of unalive bodies, human rights alarms, sanctions, travel bans, financial restrictions, all under the pretense of morality. But at its core, this is about punishing defiance. It is about making an example of any leader who refuses to obey. You see, for over half a century, Western governments have relied on a very specific formula. Offer just enough aid to maintain dependency, just enough military training to justify control, and just enough diplomatic support to keep local elites loyal. Traoré shattered that formula. He tore up the script. And now they need to write a new one, with him cast as the villain. That's why Solenzo exploded into the media like wildfire. It's not the scale of the violence, It's not the evidence. It's not even about the victims. It's about the moment. It's about striking back against a leader who has exposed too much, too quickly. The Fulani narrative is just a weapon. The footage is just a trigger. The real target is the revolution. Because if Traore succeeds, if Burkina Faso continues on this path of unapologetic independence, the West will lose more than a client state. It will lose its ability to control the story. And without the story, the empire collapses. Do you think there is a need to look deep into matters that Western media tells you about Africa? Let us know in the comments section. Doesn't that bother you to see nations like the US with a history so ugly they don't own it talking about human rights? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.